Today, we are tackling one of the most incredible stories in all of modern history. It's the epic saga of how a collection of kingdoms and territories became the nation of India. This is a journey that kicks off with merchant ships hunting for spices and, believe it or not, ends with the birth of the largest democracy on Earth.
So, let's just start with the question that hangs over this entire story, because it sounds completely impossible, right? How on earth did a private corporation, just a single trading company, manage to take over a huge, wealthy, and powerful subcontinent? How did they pull that off? Well, that's exactly what we're going to unpack.
All right, here's our game plan. First, we'll see how a bunch of traders became the rulers. Then, we'll get into the massive rebellion that changed everything. After that, we'll explore the rise of new ideas that sparked a national awakening. From there, we dive into the Gandhian era, which brought millions into the fight. And finally, we'll cover the dramatic last steps to freedom and the creation of a new nation.
Okay, let's jump in. Our story doesn't begin with armies and invasions, but with merchants and money. See, back in the 16th and 17th centuries, India was this global powerhouse of trade, and all the European nations were desperate to get a piece of the action.
You know, what's so wild about this is that it wasn't a quick thing. The race for India's riches was a total marathon. The Portuguese were the first to show up, with Vasco da Gama in 1498. Then came the Dutch, followed by the English East India Company, which set up its first little trading post, a factory, in 1613. And finally, the French jumped into the mix. For more than 100 years, these guys were all fiercely competing for an edge.
So here's the pivot. How do you go from just trading goods to actually ruling the land? Well, it all came down to two absolutely decisive battles. The first was the Battle of Plassey in 1757. Robert Clive's victory there gave the company a staggering amount of wealth and political muscle. Then, the Battle of Buxar in 1764 really sealed the deal. After that, the East India Company was, for all intents and purposes, the master of Eastern India. Once they had that military power, the British used some incredibly clever and, ruthless political moves. One of the most effective was this thing called the Subsidiary Alliance. The pitch was simple. Hey, Indian ruler, we'll protect you with our army. But the fine print was brutal. You had to pay for those British troops, let them live in your kingdom permanently, and kick out all other Europeans. You were basically trading your freedom for a false sense of security, slowly becoming a puppet in your own court.
And the land grab just got more and more aggressive. Later on, a guy named Lord Dalhousie came up with the doctrine of lapse. The rule was simple and shocking. If an Indian ruler died without a direct, biological heir, his kingdom was just gone, annexed by the British. Now, this wasn't just about taking territory. It was a deep insult to Indian tradition, which had always allowed for adopted heirs. You can imagine the fury this caused. So let's get to our second act, because all of this simmering resentment from the stolen kingdoms, the ruined economies, the social meddling, it had to go somewhere. And in 1857, it exploded. The Great Revolt was the violent climax of 100 years of discontent. This was the moment India pushed back and pushed back hard.
And make no mistake, this was no small-time mutiny. It was a massive rebellion. You can see here just how widespread it was, with leaders popping up all across northern and central India. You had the last Mughal emperor Bahadur Shah Zafar as a figurehead in Delhi, the legendary warrior queen Rani Lakshmi Bai in Jhansi, Nana Sahib in Kanpur. This just shows you the sheer scale of the uprising.
Now, even though the revolt was eventually crushed, it had an absolutely colossal impact. The British government back in London was horrified. They realized the East India Company couldn't be trusted to run a country anymore. So in 1858, they dissolved the company. Just like that. The rule of India was handed directly to the British Crown, and Lord Canning, who was in charge during the revolt, became the first ever viceroy. The British Raj had officially begun.
After the military defeat of 1857, the fight for India started to change. The battle moved away from the battlefield and into people's minds, into classrooms, printing presses, and public debates. This was a new kind of awakening, a battle of ideas, to reform and unite Indian society for the fight ahead.
And just look at this incredible burst of intellectual energy. You had visionaries like Rajaram Mohan Roy challenging old social problems and pushing for modern ideas. Thinkers like Vivekananda were reintroducing Hindu philosophy to the world with a new sense of pride, while leaders like Sir Syed Ahmed Khan pushed for modern education for Muslims. All these movements were key to building a new modern Indian identity.
All this thinking and debating eventually needed a political home, and in 1885 it got one. A group of educated Indians, along with a retired British official, formed the Indian National Congress. This was a huge deal. For the very first time, there was a single nationwide organization designed to speak for India and demand a bigger say in how the country was run.
But it wasn't one big happy family. Right from the start, there was a major split inside the Congress. You had the moderates, who believed in Britain's sense of justice and thought the best way forward was through petitions and slow, steady reform. Then you had the extremists, guys like Lal, Ball, and Paul, who thought that was basically just begging. They argued that freedom was a birthright, not a favor, and they pushed for boycotts, self-reliance, or Swadeshi, and active resistance.
And now we get to the man who changed the entire game. When Mahatma Gandhi returned to India from South Africa, the freedom struggle completely transformed. It went from being a movement of lawyers and intellectuals to a true mass movement, pulling in millions of everyday people in a way no one had ever seen before. Gandhi's genius was his step-by-step strategy of non-violent resistance. He started small, fighting for peasant rights in a local area called Champaran. Then he went big with the nationwide non-cooperation movement in 1920. A decade later, he pulled off the incredible Dandi Salt March, a direct attack on the economic power of the British. And finally, in 1942, he made his final unambiguous demand: quit India.
Of course, the British reaction often just made things worse. They passed repressive laws like the Rowlatt Act, which led to huge protests. And when a peaceful crowd gathered in Amritsar to protest, it ended in the horrific Jallianwala Bagh massacre. For millions of Indians, that was it. That was the point of no return. After that, there was no going back to trusting British rule.
But it is so important to remember that Gandhi's path of nonviolence wasn't the only one being forged. A powerful, parallel movement was led by the revolutionary Subhash Chandra Bose. He was convinced that India could only win its freedom through force. During World War II, he actually formed the Indian National Army to fight the British. His famous call to arms, "Give me blood and I will give you freedom," still echoes today.
And that brings us to the final, dramatic chapter. After 2 devastating world wars, the British Empire was exhausted and broke. It simply couldn't hold on to India anymore. The end came incredibly fast, bringing with it both the joy of freedom and the absolute tragedy of partition.
Just look at how quickly this all happened at the end. In 1946, the British sent a mission to negotiate the handover. Just a year later, the last viceroy, Lord Mountbatten, laid out his plan, which tragically included partitioning the subcontinent. At the stroke of midnight, August 15, 1947, India was finally independent. But the story wasn't quite over until January 26, 1950, when India adopted its own constitution and officially became a republic.
And so the whole thing comes full circle. The British Raj, which started with Lord Canning as its very first viceroy, came to an end with its last, Lord Mountbatten. The real symbol of the final transfer of power, though, was when C. Rajagopalachari became the first Indian to hold the post of Governor-General, marking the definitive end of the colonial era.
So we end up back where we began. This journey from a simple accounting ledger and a trading post to a country's founding constitution is just a staggering piece of history. It's a story about trade, war, rebellion, and rebirth. It really makes you wonder, what does this 350-year struggle truly tell us about the power of an idea and about the real price of freedom?